Demons. They're everywhere in fiction, whether or not it's your favorite horror movie or one of the many anime that heavily embrace the demon trope. And often, probably because of the spiritual and religious context in which we were introduced to demons, their morals run opposite to what we'd consider good. But what if they didn't have to be evil? What if they were still a monster that the hero had to face, but there wasn't this implied morality? How might that influence a story? And what can it teach us about media literacy? Welcome to a running series called Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about when the monster isn't evil. So, one of the most common things you're taught when you're learning to write is something called the 4 types of conflict. Person versus person, person versus self, person versus society, and person versus nature. There's also this expanded list where there's 7 total, the remaining 3 being person versus fate, person versus the unknown, and person versus technology. I think those 3 are extensions of the original 4, but before we get there, people argue that you could take any conflict in a story and it would fall under one of those 7 categories, and maybe even, depending on how you look at it, one of the 4. Often stories are not made up of just one type of conflict, but there tends to be an overarching primary conflict. There are some examples that are more obvious and others that seem complex. Is Avatar: The Last Airbender person versus person, with Aang fighting Ozai? Or is it person versus self, Aang overcoming the internal conflict that comes with the responsibility of being the Avatar? Whether or not it's him coming to terms with the fact that he ran away in the beginning of the story, or finding a nonviolent solution that both satisfies his responsibility as the Avatar and his personal morals not to kill. Rules in screenwriting and literature tend to be less definitive than you'd think, but they still help guide us in understanding and analyzing storytelling. Now, monster movies often fall into the category of person versus the unknown. Alien, The Thing, It, Predator. And in all of these cases, there's generally speaking an assumed malice. These monsters don't just exist, they are going out of their way to pursue our heroes and threaten their safety. These stories are built around the general human inclination to fear the unknown. We're not afraid of the dark, we're just afraid of what could be in it that we can't see. The inclination to assume malice in the unknown is actually the entire premise behind the dark forest theory. It's also a natural byproduct of something that all living things experience, the overwhelming urge to self-preserve. Because self-preservation, at least to the point of reproduction, is a fundamental part of evolution. That asterisk was included, by the way, because of animals like salmon and praying mantises. Those guys are crazy. So person versus the unknown is built around that fear. But if you were to look at person versus nature, you wouldn't assume malice, just existence. In Castaway, none of the challenges the protagonists face come from a malicious place. Bad weather that takes the plane down, or the harsh living conditions that he needs to survive. They're not evil, they're just nature. And this is where Frieren Beyond Journey's End comes in. There are demons in this show, and actually before the story started, they were the primary antagonist. But I believe demons in Frieren represent nature, not the unknown. And that's incredibly important for understanding and interpreting the morals that are implied in this story. So at first glance, I don't think everyone would agree that the demons in Frieren aren't evil. But I do think there's a pretty good case to be made, because so far in the story, I think every action a demon makes can be tracked to 2 major purposes. The first is that demons eat humans. The second is that demons, just like any other creature, have an urge to self-preserve. Based off of our understanding of evolution and survival of the fittest, all of the tools and skills demons have developed are a byproduct of those 2 major factors. Language, for example, is something that Frieren specifically focuses on a lot. Demons use language to trap and self-preserve. Language isn't really used to communicate. Take, for example, this scene.
リュグナー様、父上って何?
なんだろうね。
So while they don't even really know what a father is, they know if they bring it up, they're less likely to be killed. Because essentially this is an extreme and complex form of pattern recognition. There are many different studies done with animals to measure cognitive ability. For example, the mirror test. Is an animal capable of recognizing itself as an object in a mirror rather than another animal? It showcases self-awareness. Based off of current research, only a handful of animals have passed this test so far. When these cognitive studies have extended to animals' ability to understand and communicate in human language, there have been a couple major barriers, like the ability to ask questions. Now, demons in Frieren are capable levels of communication beyond that. I'm just arguing that the use of language comes secondary to other forms of communication in their culture. Their primary form of communication seems to be based off of shows of strength, kind of like a herd of animals that has a leader. Their social hierarchies are based off of mana, which represents the strength of their main tool of self-preservation, magic. So let's answer the question as to why this is all important. In the 7th episode of Frieren, there's this line between Frieren and Lugner where he says she looks at him like he's a wild animal, to which she responds, "Well, aren't you?" Something I've argued a lot in this series and in general is that art exists beyond itself. Stories rarely exist in a vacuum. Inherent to art is both interpretation and morals and themes. When I first watched Frieren, the writing decisions surrounding demons was something I was incredibly hesitant about. Often, especially in Western media, humanoid creatures that are the target of discrimination are used as a thinly veiled metaphor for racism. Because of this trope and tendency, when demons were first introduced in Frieren, I was very nervous that it was some sort of dog whistle. Demons were introduced as these unredeemable, dangerous creatures, and I didn't like that implication. It felt like a writing decision that got muddied because of context completely independent of the story. So this is where the thesis of the video comes into play. By understanding the type of story being told, for example, the form of conflict, you can better understand the theme being implied. If this is person versus person or person versus unknown, suddenly there's bigger implications. But if it's person versus nature, we no longer have that assumed malice and implication. In that situation, humans and demons must both act out of self-preservation. It's not evil for humans to act in self-defense or for demons to try to sustain themselves. They're simply at odds with one another because of their natural inclination. And I think if you go back and watch a lot of these scenes from this arc of Frieren, you'll notice that none of the demons seem to act from a place of malice. They are creatures with ego and coldness, disconnects from things that we would normally define as human. And with this new lens, there's no metaphor or dog whistle applying to human conflict. It also makes for an incredibly fascinating antagonist for our heroes to face. I feel like this is a really cool subversion of the evil demon. And this also extends beyond Frieren. There's this common discussion, especially in anime, about the inclusion of bad things in media. In art, when should or shouldn't terrible things be included? In anime, I often see people justifying the inclusion of terrible things in media under the lens that it makes it more realistic. But more often than not, I feel like these dark topics aren't treated with the respect they deserve. A piece of fiction can include terrible things, but it's really important that the story condemns them. I also believe the more severe a dark topic is, the more important it should be for the story. If characters are justifying it, the theme must run in opposition. Take, for example, the controversial book Lolita. At first glance, you might look at the story as justifying or glorifying heinous acts, but the point of the story is actually to criticize the topic it's written about. To oversimplify, the protagonist is the bad guy, and the entire story is to explore how he can convince himself what he's doing is okay. It's built around the rationalization of unacceptable actions, and this criticism of the topic is why it can be accepted as a classic despite its very controversial topic. Now, I'm incredibly critical of the popular running series Mushoku Tensei, and I think that criticism comes from the central conflict in the story. Because the thing that initially got me to try the show was the premise of redemption. People told me that the story was about someone who's bad learning to be better. I think that's a large reason why people love the show as much as they do. And I believe aspects of Mushoku Tensei do a very good job, especially in the first season, of including dark things that seem relevant to the story. Rudeus's unhealthy obsession with sex is a byproduct of his self-worth. This show constantly dances around the line of what is and isn't acceptable. But in the first season, it felt like largely there were consequences for his bad actions. The author wasn't condoning them. And in the finale, in some ways, it felt like they treated the entire topic with more respect, and that in retrospect justified more of the season before it. But I feel like so much of that progress and growth was undermined in the next season. And more than anything, bad actions seemed glorified as much as criticized. I thought Mushoku Tensei was person versus self, Rudeus overcoming his shortcomings and pitfalls, growing and learning the impacts of his actions, that everyone is a human being and they deserve respect. But I feel like the story became person versus society, and then suddenly all of the hypersexualization that was being included stopped feeling justified. The bad actions were rewarded. By understanding the type of conflict a story is engaging in, it can help you understand the morals being argued. Art is meant to be interpreted, and an interpretation is not definitive. My perspective on Mushoku Tensei is far from absolute. It's likely tons of people disagree with what I'm saying, and that's okay. But Mushoku Tensei lost me. Because I was consuming the story under the assumption that Rudy was on some sort of path of redemption, a character meant to be liked despite his shortcomings, who would eventually grow through them. The more I saw the way they executed that story, the less I believed it was the actual story they were trying to tell. Whereas with Frieren, at first I was so hesitant, but the more I sat with it, discussed it, and talked to people around me, the more I feel justified in consuming the content and the moral argument being implied. And that was all supported in better understanding the tools used to tell the story. Because if the demons aren't evil, it adds so much to the story.